Okay, I'm really excited actually right now because in my eyes, I'm sitting next to a living legend. What we have here, I know, is a humble man, and he's really not, you can see by his reaction, but this guy has more stories than we have time for today. I'd like to introduce you to Stephan Schwartz. Stephan, you know, for such a person that's done amazing, groundbreaking work in all sorts of fields, consciousness and, you know, just the capacity of humans to do all sorts of extraordinary things. Could you just give us a, I know it's probably difficult to give us a brief introduction, but, you know, tell us what's the main body of your work.
I'm interested in consciousness, both individually, at the individual level, and so I've spent almost half a century now studying extraordinary human performance. And I'm also interested in how consciousness at the individual, when it is aggregated into a collective intention, can bring about social transformation that produces well-being.
Yes.
I feel very strongly that we as a civilization stand at a kind of crossroads, and we've got to decide, are we prepared to support well-being, or are we going to become so mesmerized by profit and short-term effects that we allow ourselves to move into the catastrophe of climate change without proper preparation?
Yes, and that is such an important topic, and excuse the pun, but it's a very hot topic at the moment as well.
I wish it were hotter.
Yes,
much hotter.
Indeed, indeed. I mean, that's a passion of mine. I used to run a renewable energy company, and the biggest frustration with that was actually it was policy change which destroyed a whole industry in the UK, which was actually thriving and accelerating and growing incredibly quickly. But due to bureaucracy, you know, thousands of companies suffered tremendously.
Right.
And, you know, I mean, that's kind of your current passion, but, you know, some of the, we'll get back to that in a moment, because that's something that's a big passion of mine, social change, and, you know, making preparation to make a better future. You know, that's something which is a big passion of mine, right. Which is, you know, one of the reasons why we engage.
Right.
But another topic that I would love to kind of brief upon is the remote viewing stuff, which, I mean, how long have you been researching this?
Since 1968.
Since 1968?
Yeah, I got interested, Adrian, in the question, are we more than animated meat? And because I'm a very sort of methodical kind of guy, and I go at things very methodically, I wanted to develop a technique to explore what in religion is called the spirit or the soul, but I didn't want to do it in religious terms or in terms of any particular affiliation with any movement or anything. I simply wanted to know, is there an aspect of consciousness that is not physiologically based, that exists outside of space-time? And I wanted to do that, because I'm an experimentalist, in a way in which the experimental setting was sufficiently rigorous and controlled that the outcome of the experiments could be the explanation that they did indeed involve this aspect of consciousness, that was objectively verifiable in such a way that it could be accepted. I'm a Planckian. You know, in 1931, in the Observer newspaper, Max Planck gave an interview, and he was, of course, at that point, one of the most famous scientists in the world, father of quantum mechanics, and they asked him, you know, you're one of the most famous scientists in the world, he and Einstein, and what have you learned? And his answer surprised everybody. He said, well, what I've learned is that consciousness is fundamental and primary. You cannot get behind consciousness. Space-time arises from consciousness, not consciousness from space-time. Consciousness is the fundamental of everything. And so I took that aboard and thought, how could you develop a rigorously controlled experiment? And I had been studying the Edgar Cayce material and other kinds of related material. And so I began doing what I originally called distant viewing. That is, asking people to describe persons, places, or events from which they could not know about because they were separated by reason of either time or space or both. And so I created a protocol for doing that and began experimentation. I was in government in the United States, working as the special assistant to the Chief of Naval Operations, and a friend who had access to translations of documents that came out of the Soviet Union began sending me papers of a researcher named Leonid Vasiliev. And Vasiliev had asked the question that I was really focused on at that time in my life, and that is consciousness an electromagnetic phenomenon? Mm-hmm. And Vasiliev, who was a physiologist in then Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, he asked the same question, and so he began carrying out a series of experiments in which he asked people to describe things when they were down in mine shafts or in Faraday cages that block out the EM spectrum. They could, and indeed they could do it just as well as they could do it on the surface. And gradually, little by little, he eliminated all the parts of the EM spectrum except one, what's called ELF, extreme low frequency electromagnetic. That's 300 to 300 hertz. And he said, when he finally concluded, he said, if this kind of consciousness, what used to be called ESP, is real, and it's electromagnetic, then it must be in the ELF spectrum because I've eliminated everything else. But the only way that you could actually eliminate ELF would be to put somebody in a submarine because only seawater will provide sufficient shielding. And at that point, as I was the special assistant to the Chief of Naval Operations, the Navy, the United States Navy, was also interested in ELF, and they had been studying exactly how far ELF radiation penetrates into seawater, and also, and equally important, the bit rate of transmission. That is, how much information could you transmit?
Because the lower the frequency, the lesser the bit rate.
Yeah, the lower the frequency, the lower the bit rate. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, if you saw the movie The Quest for Red October, there's this scene where they get the message while they're in the submarine, and it's just a couple of numbers, and you have to go to a book, and what they did was they looked, 1, 2, 3 means target so-and-so. Because you can only get that little bit around. And I knew from the remote viewing research, or then the distant viewing research I was doing, that the amount of information that was typically produced in a remote viewing session was way in excess of what could be done with ELF, but that wasn't definitive. So Vasiliev was not able to obtain a submarine. So I went in those days to Hyman Rickover, Admiral Hyman Rickover, who was the father of the nuclear navy, of the American Navy, and asked him if he would let me go aboard one of the boomer submarines, the deep ocean missile submarines. And he was afraid the media would get involved and make fun of him, and so he didn't want to, he just didn't want to do it. So he said, I'm really sorry, Stephen, but I'm not going to do it. So it didn't look like it was ever going to get answered. And then in late 1976, two friends of mine, Don Walsh and Don Keach, who had gone to Don Walsh had made the deepest dive in history in the Challenger Deep of the Mariana Trench with a man named Auguste Piccard in a deep ocean submersible called the Trieste.
Which is quite an exciting thing to watch, because the window exploded halfway
Yeah,
down,
I was
didn't it?
very excited.
I mean, that takes a ball of steel as strong as the one you were going down in.
Yeah, 17. I think it was 17,000 plus feet.
Yeah.
Anyway,
it was 13,500 psi.
Yeah, and I mean it's an extraordinary experiment. Anyway, and Don Keach had found the bomb off Palermo's that had been lost by the United States. Anyway, they had retired and taken over the Institute of Marine and Coastal Studies of the University of Southern California, and they said to me, we will pay for 3 days in a submarine. We have a submarine that's coming down to do its sea trials, and we'll give you 3 days to do these weird experiments you want to do. So the question was, is it possible for a person sitting, well, they were sitting all over the world, is it possible for a person sitting somewhere on Earth, on land, to reach out and reach through hundreds of feet of seawater?
Can you recall the actual depth that you went down to?
Over 1,000 feet. Is it possible for them to locate a previously unknown wreck on the sea floor? That was the first part. The second part, my design was to put somebody in the submarine and see whether they could reach up through the water and describe where somebody was hiding that we didn't know. So these are triple blind, double blind experiments. And they could do it. And so I took that information and decided to begin a research laboratory, began the Mobius Laboratory. And then I was approached, the next thing was I was approached by two women historians, and they asked me, could you locate the tomb of Alexander the Great in Alexandria, Egypt? I mean, we know it exists. And I had, by that time, written a book called The Secret Vaults of Time, in which I had covered all of the examples of using what we call non-local consciousness, that is non-physiologically based consciousness, in archaeology. And I liked archaeology because it offered very rigorous triple blind experiments. You know, the usual kind of criticism is, oh, well, you went into the library and you found an old book or that kind of thing, or somebody knew and you talked to them and they told you, that kind of thing. But archaeology offered the very rigorous circumstances in which everybody agreed we know the thing exists, but we don't know where it is. And so these women approached me and I decided to do it. And so the questions that we asked were, could we locate the tomb of Alexander? Could we locate the palace of Cleopatra, the palace of Mark Antony called the Timonium, and the lighthouse of Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world? And then we were challenged by the University of Alexandria. I had 5 universities that became involved in this: Oxford, MIT, the University of Warsaw, University of Alexandria. They asked me, before they would give me permission to do what I wanted to do, the governor of Alexandria, Mohammed Hilmi, and the archaeologists at the University of Alexandria said, you have to prove to us that this works. And I said, well, you know, how does, you know, what is it you want? And they said, well, you have to locate a buried building in a buried city in the middle of the desert. And I said, okay, we would do it. And as it happened, the area where this buried city was thought to be, but they didn't know, had been previously surveyed by the University of Guelph in Canada, and they had reported there's nothing there.
And how long had they actually surveyed that place for?
Well, they were trying to find this city and then these buildings underneath this buried city.
And it was quite some time they'd been looking, hadn't it?
Yeah, oh yeah. And so we're talking about roughly 1,700 square kilometers. So along with, I had 2 remote viewers with me, and we discovered that it took us about 4 hours to discover it. And the remote viewers literally staked out the building, the corners of the building. Corners are very elegant. They described at what depth we would find it, how many rooms there were, objects we would find in the site. They said it was a Christian building, not a Roman building. That was Byzantine, not Roman. All of this contradicted everything that the archaeologists thought.
Which is quite specific detail,
yeah,
isn't it?
very specific, down to 5/8 of an inch, where they asked us to locate a building that had mosaic tiles, and we found these little 5/8 of an inch, I don't know how many centimeters that is, but these little bitty tiles, red, white, and black, and they were described as having smooth marble tops, but a white subfloor that was still attached to them. So it's very specific stuff. And they were able to do it.
I mean, this was the video we watched in your talk the other day.
And I videoed this whole thing as I videoed the whole submarine experiment. In fact, anybody that wants to can go to YouTube.
Well, we'll actually put a link just below. So, you know, if you want to have a look at this video with a rather younger, more dapper, well, I don't know if more dapper should be the right term, but...
definitely younger.
Definitely younger. Just click on the link below and you'll be able to actually watch the full video.
Yeah, and so we did Deep Quest. That was the submarine experiment. And the Alexandria Project. I wrote a book called The Alexandria Project about that. And that really, those 2 experiments really set me in motion. I began to ask questions like, is there a particular kind of personality that defines people that can do this? And so we spent a great deal of money and an awful lot of time, and lots of scientists got involved. And the net of it was that no, there is no personality profile, although extroverts do it slightly differently than introverts. But what we discovered is this is an ability that is spread through the population like any human skill. That is, there are a few people at one end that are really, really good at it, just like they're really, really good violin players or tennis players or whatever. And there's a few people at the other end who either cannot or will not get it. And then most of us fall somewhere in the middle. It's a bell curve.
Mm-hmm.
And that, actually, I would say, this is an estimate, about 12% of the population are really good at it. But almost everybody can do it to some degree. And we've tested thousands. I personally have tested 23,000 people. So it's a lot of people, and we have it's become pretty solid. The statistics for remote viewing at this point are the chances of it happening by chance are greater than 1 in a billion, where 1 in 20 would be considered significant. Anyway, so I started the Mobius Laboratory, and I discovered that at the same time there was a government laboratory up at SRI, Stanford Research Institute, who were doing what amounts to psychic spying, remote viewing spying, for the CIA and American military, founded by Hal Puthoff and Russ Targ, Ed May. And we became friends and did some work together. I personally would not do classified research because I felt that anytime we discovered something about consciousness, it ought to be made immediately available to everybody. But that's just my personal view. And so for the next 30, what is it now? It's longer than that. God, it's almost 50 years. That's what I've done. And then I got interested in healing is one of the oldest beliefs that humanity has. Mm-hmm. Is it possible for one organism through intention to have an effect for good or ill on the well-being of another organism? And so I began doing therapeutic intention studies. And it turns out people can do it. And they can do it under extraordinarily rigorous circumstances. So it's not a placebo effect. I mean, it's not that you're suggestible or that sort of thing. And then the other area that I began looking at is when I began to compare the descriptions, the subjective descriptions of great scientists about their aha moment. You know, Poincaré says, I'm going across the street and suddenly I had this sort of vision and I can see the solution to the equation that I'm working on. Or Tesla says, I'm walking across Central Park and he saw the electric motor. And he went back to his laboratory and he drew it and he said to his engineers, build this. Didn't prototype it, they just built it and turned it on and it ran. Or Einstein says he got the theory of relativity one day while he was whiling away some time in a canoe. Or Descartes says he got his insights that they arose from a dream that he had in Ulm when he was a young soldier, a young military officer. So I looked at that, and then you look at people like Saint Teresa of Avila, that sort of thing, and I looked at what the remote viewers were describing that they were experiencing, and I saw there were these extraordinary commonalities between genius, moments of spiritual epiphany, and someone doing some sort of non-local perception task. And I have concluded that it's the same experience modulated by context and intention. That is, a scientist is trying to get a scientific insight, so that's what he gets. A spiritual pilgrim is trying to have some experience of the divine, and so that's what they experience. A remote viewer is trying to describe the teacup hidden in the closet around the world. That's what they get. And we discovered as we went on with this kind of remote viewing research that distance didn't matter. There were some studies that were done by a man named Ingo Swann, who's the person who coined the word remote viewing. It's a terrible term, by the way, because it has nothing to do with remote and has nothing to do with viewing. But we didn't know better at that time, and that's what caught on. But anyway, and he and a man named Harold Sherman, who was also a very good remote viewer, decided to do a series of experiments in which they would describe Mercury and Jupiter prior to the space probes that NASA was sending out arriving. And so they did these experiments and described both Mercury and Jupiter in ways that radically contradicted what was thought to be true. And then when the space probes actually got there, it turned out they were exactly right. In the Alexandria project, we were able to find, we found Cleopatra's Palace, we found the Lighthouse of Pharos, we found Mark Antony's Timonium, we found the buried building. So clearly people are able to go back in time to describe in detail things which happened thousands of years ago. So time doesn't matter. And distance doesn't matter because the Sherman-Swan experiments about Mercury and Jupiter show us that distance doesn't make any difference. Therefore, and when you look at that kind of research in the context of near-death research, for instance, and the reincarnation research of Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker and Erlander Halson, which is very meticulous work, it becomes clear that that we are not animated meat, that there is a continuity of consciousness, and that the materialist paradigm, the idea of the paradigm arose from a man named Thomas Kuhn, probably the leading historian and philosopher of science in the 20th century. And he formulated this idea of how a particular common perspective on a worldview becomes a paradigm in science. And then he says, eventually what happens is anomalies begin to accumulate, things that paradigm won't cover, and then the paradigm goes into crisis, and then a new paradigm emerges. And so I think we're at the place, exactly as Kuhn describes, we're in crisis. and that a new non-materialist paradigm is occurring, and that people feel this impulse. You, for instance, are doing work that is very similar to this kind of thing. We know lots of other people between us who are doing this. This is an impulse. A man named Roger Nelson is doing a project called the Global Consciousness Project. Roger began doing research in asking the question, could an individual, through consciousness alone, alter the performance of a random number generator? Now, the whole point of random number generators is they're supposed to be random.
Yeah, and they're quantum random number generators. So these are astronomically, random.
Yeah, and so that's their function. They're designed to be random. And what they discovered and reported on was that people could do it. And then Roger asked a very important question. He asked if a whole group of people, a collection of people, would hold a common intentioned awareness because of some event, like Princess Diana's death or the tsunami in Japan or something like that, would that cause random number generators scattered all over the planet to go non-random? And in fact it does. So that's telling us that when there is a coalescence of intentioned awareness, particularly with a high emotional state, that we literally are altering the substance of reality. I began doing research on could people, for instance, an experiment would be take a bottle of wine and split it into two halves, and you take you have a group of people focus on one half of this one half of the bottle, that's a treated bottle, just focus their intention on it, and the other half, nothing happens. And then to people who know nothing about all this backstory, could they then taste the wine and tell a difference? And lo and behold, they routinely describe the treated wine, to which people have focused intention, as being a better quality of wine than the control wine, even though it comes out of the same bottle. A researcher named Dean Radin had Buddhist monks. He bought a pound of tea and split it into two piles, and he had them focus on one part and not on the other, and then he brewed the tea and he had people taste it and say, which tea do you think is better? And they routinely picked the tea that's treated. And he did it with chocolate bars, where he'd split the chocolate in two parts and have people focus attention on one part and not on the other, and they could do that. So what's emerging in science now, it's not the dominant view, it's still lots of skeptical people about it, but what is emerging is the idea that consciousness, that Planck is right, that consciousness exists prior to incarnation, continues after incarnation, and that some part of us, which what religion calls the soul, episodically manifests another personality. You're not coming back, I'm not coming back, but that part that is the eternal part of us will manifest another personality episodically for reasons we don't understand very clearly. And very careful studies, about 2,500 cases on this, show that when people come back, when the soul manifests another personality, oftentimes it has scar tissue or birthmarks from events which occurred in some earlier life. So we're beginning to get a different world, a different view of the world, and we're also beginning to see that all living beings have some measure of consciousness, and that all consciousness is interconnected and interdependent, and that we live not isolated within our brain, within our bodies.
Which is the modern scientific kind of paradigm at the moment.
Yeah, but that we live in a matrix of life. And I think that's very important at the social level, because once you begin to recognize that you live in a matrix of life, a matrix of consciousness, you begin to understand that all life is interconnected and interdependent, and it leads you to a different worldview, and you begin to make different choices. And as we face climate change and sea rise and the collapse of the insects and the collapse of the bees and the collapse of the coral reefs, all of this stuff that's coming, I think the only way we're going to get through this is by recognizing that we live in this matrix on the planet. We live in the Goldilocks zone on the surface, that there's life above us and life way beneath us, but that the choices that we make are going to determine how our children and our grandchildren live and what their world will be like. And I cannot think of anything more important than that.
Yes, I mean, I completely agree with your point. It is something that we need to be more conscious about. I mean, this is consciousness in itself, but the problem is, I think these days, the barrier that we've got to break through is people are just too apathetic. You know, we're here to be entertained, not everybody wants to really think, and we need more people realizing that we can actually make an impact.
Yes. I spent 18 years, I got interested in social transformation. My belief is the function of the state is to foster well-being, from the organisms of the bacteria in the earth, to individuals, to families, to communities, to nations, to the planet itself. I think the function of the state should be to foster well-being. Mm-hmm. And I got 4 times in my life I've been involved with changing history. And I've paid close attention to what happened and why things work and why things don't work. And about 18 years ago, I really started looking at that very seriously. And I studied social transformational movements from 1775. I'm an American, so the American Revolution. Actually, all the way up to about 2000, 2003, something like that. Over about 216 transformational movements. And what I discovered was quite extraordinary. It was not at all what I would have thought. You know, normally, if you think about social transformation, you think about generals and armies and wars. I mean, that's what we put in parks, guys on horses with swords. But the truth of the matter is that violent change only works about 25% of the time, and it doesn't last. I mean, if you think about it, National Socialism, the Nazis, that movement only lasted about 10 or 20 years, depending on how you calculate it. Communism in the Soviet Union, in fact, the Soviet Union itself only lasted 73 years, well within a single person's lifetime. And they're expensive, violent, zero-sum games in which there are winners and losers.
Usually whereas, people that are financing it.
Yes, whereas if you look at non-violent change, for instance, someone like Gandhi, in fact, let me give you an example. Anyway, before I say that, non-violent change succeeds 75% of the time. It's the exact opposite. More importantly, it's enduring, it's not violent, and it is much more pleasant for everybody involved. I mean, if you think about Gandhi, he got independence for his country without a war. And when just before he was assassinated, a reporter went up and asked him a very important question. He said, "Oh, Gandhiji, how did you have no money, you have no official position, you had no army. How did you force the British to leave India? India was their most important colonial possession. The Queen is the Empress of India. They've been here for 300 years, over 300 years. How did you force the British to leave?" And his answer speaks to this issue of what I mean by beingness. He said, "It isn't what we did that mattered, although that mattered. It isn't what we said that mattered, although that mattered. It was the nature of our character, who we are, that led the British to choose to leave India. And to give a sense of how powerful a single individual can be, think about this. Henry David Thoreau, a transcendentalist in America in the late 19th century, who everybody thinks of as a kind of wacky, eccentric guy, is sitting one day by his little pond, Walden Pond, and I've been there, it's a little pond. And he gets this idea about what he calls civil disobedience. And he means that at several levels. Civil in that it's social, but also it's civil in the sense that you English mean it, right?
Yeah.
And so he writes an essay called Civil Disobedience. Gandhi is an obscure little barrister in South Africa who's rather proud of himself. He's become a barrister and he has a kind of sense of himself. And he buys a first-class ticket on a railroad. And they won't let him ride in the first class because he's an Indian, racism. And so they make him ride in the third class, and he gets really upset about it. They put him in jail. Somehow, I don't know how this happened, he discovers this essay, Civil Disobedience. And he realizes that this is the key. And he goes back to India, and he organizes what becomes the independence movement. Martin Luther King, an obscure preacher in the American South, is upset because as a man, his manhood is challenged and constantly thwarted because he's a black man. It's just pure racism, just like Gandhi. And he is looking around, what can I do to bring about change? And he discovers Gandhi, and then he discovers that Gandhi was moved by this essay, Civil Disobedience, and he adopts that into the American Civil Rights Movement, of which I became a part as a teenager in my 17, 18-year-old. And so he achieves in the 1964, 1965 Voting Rights and Civil Rights Acts. We get a situation where one man, an obscure guy, nobody paid, Thoreau, now he's quite famous as a transcendentalist, but at the time, he was this sort of eccentric little guy. He writes something, and as a result, the entire course of history of 3 countries is changed. India, Great Britain, and the United States are all altered from their course that you would have expected them to continue, all because this man wrote this, and he influenced another man, and that influenced a third man, and they each begin movements. So, the takeaway is, there is no force on earth, no army more powerful, no government more powerful than the collective intention of a mass of human beings committed to well-being.
I mean, that really just needs thinking about just for a moment. And I think the key message here is we are all one. There's one race, the human race. We are 99%. And when we can, it's not that we have to do something. This is the key, it's not about human doings, it's about human beings. And when we can all be together and set a collective intention and say, I want this, and this is all I'm going to be happy with, things change. It was Wayne Dyer who said, when you change, how you look at things, the thing that you look at changes.
Yes. Well, I will give you the key. What I've learned. When you get like Plunk, what have you learned? Here's what I've learned. Every day, you make thousands of decisions. You may not think of them as decisions. You're just going through your life. You go into the store to buy toothpaste. Which kind of toothpaste do you buy? Well, most people buy the toothpaste their mother told them to buy, or that their college roommate told them, or whatever. You ask yourself instead, you use what I call the quotidian choice. Every day you make lots of decisions. Every time you make a decision, be aware that you are making a decision, that you are voting for a social outcome. You consistently and universally always choose of the options available to you the one that is the most compassionate, life-affirming, and fostering of well-being. That requires some work, because you have to ask yourself, well, which company? I mean, do I want to buy this toothpaste or this toothpaste? Well, do these people treat their employees well? Do these people treat their employees better? I mean, the truth may be none of the options that are available to you are great options, but inevitably one option is better. And you consistently choose the option that is the most compassionate, life-affirming, and fostering of well-being. You tell 10 friends, this is what I'm doing, and you invite them to do it with you. And you ask them to tell 10 friends. Well, let's say, just for the sake of illustration, that 1,000 people, I'm sure it's much larger than that, but just to illustrate it, 1,000 people are watching this right now. Well, if they tell 10 friends, that's 10,000. And then we have 100,000. And then we have 1 million. And then we have 10 million. We know from the research that when 10% of a population, any population, whether it's a church group or a nation, make a change in consciousness, that the entire cohort has to adjust to that change. So if we can get from this program 10% of the people who watch this to actually do this, to exercise the quotidian choice, every day from now on, I'm going to choose that which is the most compassionate, life-affirming, and fostering of well-being, and I'm going to tell 10 friends what I'm doing, and I'm going to invite them to join me. Literally, the people that are watching this video can change the course of history.
Yeah, and in this day and age, you know, what we call it is voting with your wallet. And a lot of people are disenfranchised with voting for politicians, and voting with your wallet is potentially the most powerful thing you can do. Yes. And when you combine it with another modern phenomena of things going viral, because that's what you're talking about, yes. a viral explosion of people being conscious about what they're buying. And I think one thing which does probably need to change to help, you know, facilitate this process is more information about the products. People knowing which products are more ethical to buy. And because a lot of people buy with their wallet as far as what's the cheapest product. And the challenge is the cheapest product quite often isn't the most ethical product. Right. So there is a little bit of...
Yes, you have to make a commitment.
Yeah.
As Gandhi said, you know, it's not what we do that matters, although that matters. It's not what we say that matters, although that matters. It is the nature of our beingness, who we are, the character, what we choose to support. That is the thing that brings about social change. And we have the power to change the course of history into a life-affirming society in which prosperity, health, wellness is the norm, not the exception.
And I think that probably is a perfect place to say thank you very much.
My pleasure.
For taking your time out to speak with me and just share an incredibly powerful message, which I personally am going to spend, you know, I've got no plan B. My modus operandi, my single agenda is to create social change for the entirety of humanity in my own way. And that's no ego thing. I'm not saying I'm going to change the world, but if I can change one little bit of it, and that seed then, you know, what was the phrase that Mother Teresa says? That, you know, she can't change everything, but she can make a ripple in the pond, and that ripple will propagate out. You know, it's not the exact words, but I'll put the quote on the video.
It doesn't require an army. It doesn't require money. You know, I wrote a book called The 8 Laws of Change that I put together because I wanted to give people the tools to do this. And there are many examples of this. You'd be surprised. For instance, one thing that I was very struck by when I was doing this, I began looking at the Quakers. Now, the Quakers are a tiny little group of people in the United States and England, principally. I mean, in the United States, there are about 87,000 Quakers out of a population of 317 million. I mean, it's a tiny little group of people. Most people have never met a Quaker, have no idea what Quakers are about or what they believe or anything else. And yet, if you look at almost every social transformational movement in the United States history, going back to the colonial period, that is wellness-oriented, well-being oriented, abolition, penal reform, public education, women's suffrage, the nuclear freeze, the environmental movement, what you discover is that somewhere at the very beginning is this tiny little group of Quakers. And so clearly, a small group of people who hold a clear intention and are committed to it and who follow these 8 laws that I described have the capacity to produce a society predicated on well-being. And I can think of no higher calling.
Me neither. So I would say if you're interested in creating social change, if you think this world has the potential of being better, subscribe now, you know, click like, share the video. It's about getting the message out there. It's about getting other people to collaborate together to create change. Stephan Schwartz, you are a living legend, and I thank you very much. And I look forward to just reading the
8 Laws of Change.
8 Laws of Change. You've just recommended me that this weekend, and that's going to be the next book I'm going to read.
Oh, thank you very much, Adrian. I appreciate it.
Pleasure.
So it was lovely to talk to you.
Thank you very much.